So this passage, the questions start on page 410, but the passage starts 2 pages before, and this one is entirely SIN standards. So these are the standards that you need to know for your science fair projects. The first one says, which of the following statements best explains why students varied the mass of the weight atop the wooden block in experiment 1? Varied the mass, that should clue you in, and it says the students did it, that you're talking about an independent variable. So if we go back to experiment 1, students placed a wooden block with the surface area of 100 centimeters squared in the apparatus depicted. A tangential force was applied, and the force at which the block began to slip was recorded. So the force at which the block began to slip, that's what they're measuring. So whatever they record is their dependent variable. The experiment was repeated using weights of differing masses atop the wooden block. The forces required to cause the wooden block to slip were recorded in table 1. So, just because of what they recorded, you know that force required to move the block is the dependent variable. So, measure the amount of downward force between the wooden block and the plane. No. Vary the amount of tangential force on the wooden block. Study how different materials affect friction. It was the same material, so you know it's not C. And then D, vary downward force between the wooden block and the plane. So, the answer is here, because this is what they wanted to change. They were measuring the force that it took to move, and this way you have different forces to see how the block will slip through. So, the reason that it is not A, although that's the second best answer, is because they weren't measuring the amount of downward force. What they were measuring is the force it took to overcome, and they wanted to change that to see if that changed with the weight. Which of the following factors was not directly controlled in the students, or by the students in experiment 3? So, in this experiment, the coefficient of friction between the wooden block and the plane was lowered by the application of grease to the plane. The procedures from experiment 1 were repeated using the wooden block and the weights from experiment 1. So they changed the weights still, that's still your independent variable, and then they also applied grease. So the answer to this question, let's look at our choices. The tangential force required to move the wooden block, the mass of the weight atop the wooden block, we know they did the same procedure as experiment 1, so it's not G. The coefficient of friction between the wooden block and the plane, they did control that because they lowered it by applying grease, so it's not H. The surface area of the side of the wooden block in contact with the plane. They used the same block that they did in experiment 1, and it's only one block. So here, your answer is F. They did not directly control the force to move the wooden block because that's actually what they were measuring. Alright, 7. Several students were asked to push a box to the other end of their classroom. Based on the results of the experiments, how could the students minimize the amount of force necessary to push the box? So, the force here, if you look at table 3, as the weight goes up, the force goes up. And let's look at table 2. As the weight goes up here, the force goes up. As the weight goes up, the force goes up. So they have the same trend for all of these. So here they changed the surface area. And then here they changed the weight. So if we look at these, 6.1, 12.3, these were both of the same. So it didn't matter if you changed the surface area. So that's not going to lower it, so that's not going to be our answer. And then here, if you look on the first page, at 0.5, the force is 6.1. So they lowered the coefficient of friction, and that made the box easier to push. So the answer to 7 here has to talk about lowering the coefficient of friction. So rotating it with the smallest area, we know that that's not true, but B is our answer, because it says decrease the coefficient of friction between the box and the floor by painting the bottom of the box with grease. And then 8. If experiment 2 is continued using a 3 kilogram mass atop the wooden block, the tangential force required for the block to slip will be approximate. So that's asking us to identify a trend. That's extrapolating here. So we know that as the mass goes and increases, the force goes up. This is extrapolating because we don't have a 3.0 value. But what do you think this will be? So this goes up by 6, by 6, by 6, by 6. So 30 by about 6 will be somewhere in the 36 to 37 range here. probably 36 with a decimal after it. And that's just following that pattern. So the answer here is J, 36.8 newtons.